Hi, it is now 1 p.m. Eastern Time. You have joined the webinar for Adopting a Gender-Responsive Approach for Women in the Justice System, a resource guide. To allow for additional sign-ins past the hour, we'll be starting in about 1 minute. Hello, thank you for joining today's Adopting a Gender-Responsive Approach for Women in the Justice System, a resource guide webinar. My name is Felicia Lopez-Wright, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the CSG, or Council of State Governments Justice Center. I will be moderating today's webinar, which is hosted by the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance, or BJA. Next slide, please. To give you an overview of today's webinar, first, we will do introductions of our speakers and provide a brief overview of the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Council of State Governments Justice Center, the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program, and the Gender Responsive Services Resource Guide. Then we will get into the content of this webinar, which starts with a review of why gender matters in criminal justice, and then provides information regarding evidence-based practices for women in the justice system and how to integrate this research into practice. We will also have time for questions and answers before wrapping up the webinar. Anytime during the webinar, you can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and entering your question. This includes both technical and content-related questions. We will try to reply to technical questions in the chat as we go, and for the content-related questions, we will keep a running list and address them at the end of the webinar. We will do our best to try to get through as many questions as possible. If you encounter technical or audio problems during the webinar, please click on the link that we just shared within the chat. Please understand that there are some technical issues that we may not be able to resolve. However, we are recording the webinar and we will post it along with the PowerPoint slides on our website within 1 to 2 weeks. As you already know, my name is Felicia Lopez-Wright and I am joined by my colleague, Rachel Lee. We are both Senior Policy Analysts within the Behavioral Health Division of the CSG Justice Center, and we primarily provide technical assistance to Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program grantees. We are also joined by Dr. Marilyn Van Deeten, who is the subject matter expert and main presenter of today's webinar content. Dr. Marilyn Van Deeten is the Director of the National Resource Center on Justice-Involved Women at the Center for Effective Public Policy. She previously co-founded Orbis Partners, where she served as the Director of Training and Program Development. Throughout her career, Dr. Van Deeten has worked to design and develop and help agencies implement evidence-based interventions and has served as an advocate for justice-involved women and their families. She is the author of Moving On, a group intervention for justice-involved women, Girls Moving On, which addresses the needs of young women, and Living Safely and Without Violence, an intensive program for women with a history of violent behavior. She created the collaborative Casework for Women model, an intensive wraparound model for justice-involved women, and Creating Calm, a workbook for women, which is part of the Resiliency Builder series. Dr. Van Deeten has served as an expert for the National Institute of Corrections, Correctional Service of Canada, and Her Majesty's Prison Service in the UK. She received her PhD from the University of Ottawa, Canada. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. I'm going to give a brief background on the Council of State Governments Justice Center. We are a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that combines the power of a membership association representing state officials in all 3 branches of government with the expertise of a policy and research team focused on assisting others to attain measurable results. Our staff develops research-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. This slide describes a bit more about our work style and how we strive to reflect Justice Center core values, which include a commitment to being independent and nonpartisan in every aspect of our work, providing rigorous, trusted, high-quality analysis, developing practical and innovative solutions informed by data and research, promoting collaboration and building consensus, and being inclusive and respectful of diverse views and experiences. The overarching goals that guide our work at the CSU Justice Center are to break the cycle of incarceration, advance health, opportunity, and equity, and use data to improve safety and justice. The mission of the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance, or BJA, is to provide leadership and services in grant administration and criminal justice policy development to support local, state, and tribal justice strategies to achieve safer communities. Specifically, BJA provides funding to support law enforcement, combat violent and drug-related crime, and combat victimization. Through the development and implementation of policy, services, and sound grants management, BJA strengthens the nation's criminal justice system and restores security in communities. Through the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program, or JMHCP, BJA aims to help states, local government, and tribal organizations improve responses to and outcomes for people with mental health conditions or co-occurring mental health conditions and substance use disorders who come into contact with the criminal justice system, and support public safety by facilitating collaboration among the criminal justice, juvenile justice, and mental health and substance use disorder treatment systems. So today's webinar focuses on the Adopting a Gender Responsive Approach for Women in the Justice System, a resource guide, which was developed collaboratively between the CSG Justice Center and the Center for Effective Public Policy's National Resource Center on Justice Involved Women. The guide can help program providers in behavioral health and criminal justice settings across the country develop gender responsive programs. The guide focuses on 6 topics that are fundamental to carrying out effective programs for women in the justice system, which are foundational elements for successful gender responsive programs, key facts about women in the criminal justice system, gender responsive criminogenic risk and needs assessment, gender responsive case management, gender responsive programming, and select resources. This guide was released on August 9th, 2021, and today we're excited to provide a deeper dive into its contents and practical use. So now I have the pleasure of handing it over to Dr. Marilyn Van Deeten, who will continue with the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Felicia. I'm really excited. I think I just moved that slide. I'm really excited to be here today. I just wanted to say I'm really grateful to the Council of State Governments for that invitation. I've had the pleasure of working in corrections for 35 years, and Felicia's already talked to you a little bit about my background, but mostly, I guess the most common thread of the work I've done is the development and implementation of evidence-based policies and practices with impacted women. But I started in the field in the late 80s, and at that time there were very few women under justice control and very little research to guide our work. So the launch of the resource guide is important. I think it represents the hard work that scholars and practitioners and advocates and justice impacted women have participated in over the last 30 years. And this group has amassed a significant body of research and practical information. And I think it's going to support our work going forward. So thank you for that. I want to thank the Council of State Governments and my predecessor at the National Resource Center for Justice of All Women for translating all of that work and integrating the findings into this guide. So that's important. Okay, we've got to start with the definition. And I'm so glad you put this up early because this is a long definition. What we're going to be focusing on in this whole seminar is what is gender responsive, why it matters. So really important that we start with this definition. I'm going to distill it just a little bit. When we use the term gender responsive, really what we're saying to you is we're referring to the development of any policy or practice when it reflects women's experiences that are supported by research conducted with and beside justice involved women. So really that's what we're looking at, research supporting the work that we're doing. So before we start today and get into the meat of this, I wanted to see if I know we have a very diverse audience today. We have individuals representing different settings, contexts, roles, responsibilities. So before we get started, I just want to see, we wanted to see if you would participate in a poll with us and let us know where you are as an agency, or if you're here as an individual practitioner, let us know where you're at. You know, what's your context with regard to implementing policies or practices when you think of women in mind, women's experiences, women's researchers. Where are you at? So just 0 if you haven't done it, not ready. 1 if you have. 2 if you're getting started, or 1 is not yet. 2 just getting started. 3 if you've implemented some policies and practices. Okay, so we're just going to wait and see what happens. Okay, so coming in, so we have people across the board. And I think we can end the poll there. I mean, this is really helpful. I think, well, you're going to share the results with everyone?
Yes, so the majority of today's webinar attendees have implemented some policies and practices that are gender responsive.
Thank you. So we've, hopefully today, for those folks who've started and you're well on the way, we hope that we can help augment or maybe help you start, help you pick another action step or look at where to go next. And for those of you who are just getting started, or you have colleagues or just really questioning whether you should do this, we hope to give you some information that can demonstrate why gender matters and why get started. So if you give me one moment, we're going to switch screens. And I am going to share you my screen. And there we go. Okay, it's how long have we been in COVID, and I still can't do this very well. All right, here we go. I'm sharing my screen now, correct? Yep. Somebody give me a thumbs up. This is what's wrong.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay,
we can see your screen.
All right, so we talked, okay, that's really helpful to me. So I would like to now just get into launching in why gender matters. So a little piece on this. Now to do this, I have to set a bit of history to set the context. And I need you to put yourself back in time, 80s, early 90s, before the dramatic climb in the number of women entering the justice system, and before women made an appearance in criminal justice research. For those of you who weren't born yet, and probably quite a few in this audience, just join me a few reflections. You've got to be there with us. So picture this, mass incarcerations in full swing, and sadly, far too many social scientists, experts, criminologists, social scientists, it doesn't matter who, but they're fueling public fear with images of violent youth. And we start hearing labels like super predators, and we hear these dire predictions of increased violence. We have other groups that are adding to this public fear by asserting that there is nothing, absolutely nothing we can do to remedy this. Rehabilitation doesn't work, policy change doesn't work, we can't change people, so the best thing we can do really is lock people up. So if you want to picture that time, it was a time of immense prison construction. And I have to say, fortunately, by the early 90s, a number of researchers pushed back against the rhetoric. And as they started to pull together the available research, they were able to demonstrate the positive impact of targeted and well-implemented treatment and policy. So by the beginning of the new millennium, almost every correctional administrator in North America had been exposed to the principles of effective intervention. And I wish I could see you all now, because I would ask you to raise your hand. Have you heard about the risk-need responsivity model? This model, and again, let me just unpack that a bit, because risk refers to providing intensive services to folks that need it most. Need refers to targeting individual factors that contribute to justice involvement and prevent people from moving forward. And responsivity refers to targeting to the approach, to using the right approach, to using an approach that ensures people are benefiting from our interventions. By the 2000s, almost every agency across North America had begun to apply at least some aspect or one of these principles within this model. And we start to see the emergence of evidence-based assessments, programs, practices. And I have to tell you, I was really excited as this model was launched. They were my PhD thesis supervisors, Jim Bonta and Don Andrews, who launched this model. And it was interesting. We really thought that this is a good thing, and it applies to everyone. It's going to benefit everyone, but there's a caveat on this. With the best of intentions, the researchers of the day believe that oh, okay, sorry. We practiced this and now my clicker is not working. Okay, there we go. I'm sorry about this. I had this smooth presentation all planned up. So something is wrong with my ability to go forward. So I'm going to go down here. Okay, that should work. Sorry about that. Okay, so by the beginning of the new, as I mentioned, we have all of this going on, and there's really good intentions with the risk need responsivity. They really thought it would benefit everyone in the same way, and we could use the same interventions for everyone and the same policies for everyone. But if you stand back for a moment and take a closer look, you realize that the data that was used to formulate that model was collected early on before the 80s and early 90s, and women made up less than 6% of the entire criminal justice population at that time. Truly, men were the standard. Women weren't fully represented in the research. They certainly were they were invisible, as a matter of fact. They really weren't there. And it's not just corrections that does this. There's a long tradition of ignoring differences in gender and race across other disciplines. For example, women have also been left out of medical and mental health research. And this has had very dire consequences for many women. And I want you just to picture for a moment the potential negative impact when we fail to disaggregate by gender during medical trials. And picture, a woman given the same dosage as men for all medications. And this is really, truly what was going on. So if you picture that, you're probably picturing a lot of really over-medicated women. Now the FDA has stepped in and there are protocols in place now, but they're fairly recent. They really didn't start to disaggregate till 2010. And we know it's not just dosage that's the problem, but it's the expression of symptoms. Symptom expression is very different for men and women. And so we see that men and women come in, how they express heart attacks, how they cope with trauma and stress, how they express mental health symptoms is very different. So we have to look at gender, and we'll just talk about this at great length. We also have to look at race and other identities and unpack and see who's benefiting from what we do. So let's go back to women in the criminal justice system, and we'll go back to the women in the justice system. I just want to say that between the 80s and 2019, just under 40 years, the number of women in jail has increased by 700%. 700%. There's nothing that increases by 700. And so we now have over 1.2 million under some form of correctional control. So as of 2018 and 19, 1.2 million under correctional control, about 1 million under community supervision if you combine probation and parole. And when we start to look closely, at these at the data, we see a pattern of really negative outcomes for women. And I think one of the most devastating is that, just look at the bottom line of the first paragraph or the first bullet. 2/3 of women who are incarcerated and returning to prison 5 years after release are not doing very well. Pew just recently released a report on community supervision and outcomes, and they reported that probation and parole supervision has become one of the most significant drivers of incarceration for women. So what's going on? What's happening? If we look at this more closely, we'll see that women under community supervision, yes, they are committing new crimes and they're being returned to jail or prison for new crimes. A lot of them are coming back for technical violations. Incidentally, a lot of the things I'm going to say today apply to men too. There are many men coming back for these same reasons. Drug-related violations, so they're testing positive on drug tests. They're not completing treatment and they're coming in for those kind of violations, or they're coming in because they're simply not failing to appear or absconding. Now, there are many ways we can interpret this. And you may have your own view of what's happening here, but I think we can all agree that we've got to do better. Like, this is just not acceptable. We have to do better. So many people are returning. We're not doing the job we should do. So whatever the understanding of whatever you feel the understanding of this data is, the fact remains that women still pose little risk to public safety. If we look at the charges women are involved in the criminal justice system, very few are coming in for violent offenses. And yet what we're seeing as we start to unpack the data, and incidentally, resources available for you on every one of these statements, all the sources are on slide 55 for this slide, so you can look at those later. But what we're starting to unpack is that not only are we doing poorly, we're having, women who are low risk are coming in, but we are actually putting women at greater risk by coming into the system. So what we're seeing is, for many women, an increase in mental health symptoms, an increase in trauma and re-traumatization. We're seeing that women leaving prison or entering the community or in the community have really complex needs, and those remain unaddressed because we're simply not addressing the right targets. Women, even before they get into the system, are less likely to get bail. They're just really not, they don't have the financial resources to do it. We see once in, as I mentioned already, more technical violations. And, women inside, we've gone to a number of states and we're assessing this data and we look, why are women getting more disciplinary reports than men? And it's quite interesting as you unpack this, because it looks like women are coming in because they're being non-compliant with orders. They're not understanding why these orders are given and they want some explanation. And so we're having women who get these disciplinary reports, and any of you who work inside realize that that can also have a dramatic impact on their access to services and family visits and opportunities. And I have to say, all of these things, when we look at the data, the negative trends are absolutely magnified for women who are Black, who are Indigenous, and all women of color. So, we are not doing what we should be doing. And we have women being more harshly treated than others. The other thing, just as
Marilyn, I'm sorry to cut you off. We were getting some messages that it's hard to hear you, that it's breaking up a bit. Not sure maybe if you're able to switch to your phone, or maybe some people are suggesting maybe if you stop the video stream, it may help a little bit with the audio. But
can we try? I just really moved it up. Is it better now? Can you give me a heads up?
It's still breaking up a little bit. It's like a little choppy.
So how do I break the video stream?
So possibly try to mute and then unmute. And if that doesn't work, to stop video.
Is this better now? I've never had this happen before, so I'm not sure what. Can you hear me now? Is this?
We're getting some answers that it's still breaking up.
Okay, so give me another recommendation. I'm really sorry. I've never had this happen before. Do you?
You can use your phone for the audio if you select the little phone, like where you can mute yourself here. If you click on that arrow, it gives you the opportunity the information to dial into the webinar, and it'll switch you to your phone for audio, which may help.
Okay, so can you tell me to do that again? I'm sorry. Where do I find?
You see the little phone to the left where it says mute? Oh, actually, because you're sharing your screen, you'll have to stop sharing your screen so you can see it.
Okay, mute.
Thank you everyone for bearing with us as we figure this out.
I don't know. Leave computer audio. Switch to phone audio. And I will do that right now. You think all through COVID this would have happened, and it didn't. So okay. So I am calling in.
Enter your meeting ID followed by pound.
Oh,
You have not entered any number. Please re-enter your meeting ID.
okay, so now I'm being paralyzed by a system that okay, enter my.
Goodbye.
You may also have to mute yourself on the computer. I don't know if possible, but I'm not hearing any feedback, and it sounds okay. If anyone else, any participants want to confirm.
Keep me posted. And okay, that is not what I anticipated would happen today. I've not ever had that occur. And now I've somehow managed to move my slides far forward. Okay.
Don't worry, it's okay. Don't worry, it's
Okay,
fine. These
so-
things happen.
Yeah, so here we are. Okay, I'm back. All right. The other thing I want to mention before we pile into this information is there are so many severe consequences for kids. And I think we all know this now. This is not anything new to us. But what we're seeing, there's incredible data coming out. And what we're seeing is that the impacts on children are incredible. And we're seeing that we're traumatizing the next generation. And we're doing it each and every time we send women back to jail or back to prison. So we can't simply ignore this data and these trends and these findings. Or we can acknowledge that what we're doing, like I said before, is just not good enough. And I think if we want to minimize harm and provide women with the resources and supports they need to success, we absolutely have to recognize that gender matters. So earlier I mentioned that at the start of the 90s, we had a little research on women, but this is changing quickly, and you'll see that in this guide. And so what we want to do now is we want to talk a little bit more about what the evidence is telling us. So for those of you who have had a chance to look at and review the resource guide, I think what's interesting is that you may have, if you look through it and sort of sifted through some of the work so far, I want to draw your attention to page 5 and 6, because 5 and 6 talk about how do we know where to start. So those of you interested in determining that, how do we know when to start? What do we do to, or how do we know where to continue, or what do we do to, beef up or expand our work? So there are tools are mentioned into the guide. And just a little caveat on this, or a little history on the development of these tools. The National Institute of Corrections, and this is an organization under the umbrella of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, they provide technical assistance and support to community corrections agencies. And again, I would ask you to raise your hand if you've used them before. Fantastic organization, supportive, and I recommend that you reach out to them if you need technical assistance. So NICIC.org is how you can do that. But NIC has been a forerunner in almost everything that has been done with women. You'll hear me mention them many times. But it was interesting because as the evidence-based, as the R&R model started to develop and there were evidence-based practices emerging in the 2000s, started to be inundated with requests for information about women. So what ended up happening is that the women, people wanted to know, hey, should we be we're hearing a rumble about being gender responsive. Should we invest in gender responsive services? And what the heck does that mean? And how do we define it? And what programs and policies should we be using with women? And it was interesting because NIC took the lead under Phyllis Moodley to pull together a group of scholars and experts to design a tool called the GIPA, the Gender Informed Practices Assessment. Now, this is the predecessor to the GRIPA. Sorry, we love acronyms, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But this was the starting point for us, because what it charged us to do, Phyllis Moodley pulled together this group of experts and people like Pat Van Burst and Andy Moss, and we're so excited to be invited on this, Alyssa Benedict, and we worked together to pull together the available research on women and to create a tool. And the tool was designed to do that. It was designed to help agencies assess how closely their policies and practices align with the available research on women. So it was really interesting because we created the GIPA. We started with working with facilities, and it allowed agencies to actually see how closely, like where their strengths were, where their challenges are, and where there are opportunities, and to advance their work across 12 domains. We looked at everything from leadership and management and operations and programs and services. We looked across the board. We piloted this tool. And we used it. We've been using it in settings to assess adherence to gender responsive principles and practices. So wonderful tool. The only problem is that it requires external experts to come in, so it's costly and there's a time commitment involved with it. And because the response was so favorable to the use of this tool, NIC decided to create another tool known as the Gender Responsive Policies and Practices, again, defined and described in the resource guide. And they created a protocol, and what they did was and it actually was designed by Barbara Owen and Nina Messina and Stephanie Covington, and they pulled together a guided protocol so that agencies could do a self-assessment. And so agencies went in, did their own self-assessment. You can do it online through the NIC website, and many agencies use this resource. People were using it fairly routinely. But what ended up happening is that many of the agencies felt they needed more support with scoring. They needed more support to help set the actions or develop action plans. So once again, the National Institute of Corrections decided to reach out, and they decided to develop coaching and training protocols to help people use these materials. So over the last year, I've had the great pleasure of working with Alyssa Benedict through the Center for Effective Public Policy. And we worked with a cooperative agreement with NIC to develop this protocol, to actually train folks in using this tool, for the tool, developing action plans. And we also created a tool. The focus is specifically on community. So we have a community version now. You know, we piloted this in 5 sites in the US, and here are some of the reported findings. You'll see it on the right hand of the slide. People feel ready to develop a strategic plan. They start the process of developing policies. Some of them, first time they've developed policies for women, help them identify gaps in programs and to identify training needs. So this has a really comprehensive process. It involves many things. It's a multi-method assessment. We do interviews with staff and women. We do surveys. We do focus groups. We do observations. We do document review. Or actually, we have the team doing it, the internal team doing it, and we teach them how to integrate the information from these reviews and then to score the GRIPA. So the end result is they have this wonderful summary of what's happening in their agency and to see how closely their work is aligning with policies and practices. So many domains in the GRIPA CV, we thought it might be illustrative to use the GRIPA as a bit of a template, as a jumping point to unveil the information in the resource guide. So we're not going to complete the GRIPA. We would need a month of your time. But I'm going to start by presenting a very high level of the research across the bolded domain. So just high level on very few bullet points on agency culture. And then you can read further if you choose to in that area. There's all kinds of stuff in the guide. And at the end of every segment, I'm going to pose some reflective questions to you. And what I'd like you to do is simply consider whether, you know, this is a strength for your agency or if it's an opportunity to do something different. So you may have received a handout or downloaded a handout. I'll refer you back to that in a moment. But for right now, before we can get started with that, I forgot this part. I want to sort of get us all on the same page, or put us all on the same page when we're talking about gender responsive. Earlier, I defined gender responsive as reflecting the experiences of impacted women and what we do in our work. Well, there's something a little bit more, and not to steal the thunder of this whole presentation, but what we've discovered over the years, the last 30 years, is that programs getting the outcomes with women are attentive to what we call these 4 core practices or principles or elements. And if you want to get the results that you need, a gender responsive approach requires you to be trauma-informed, strength-based, relational, and culturally responsive. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to review and define some of those principles. I know many of you have heard this before, so this is a review, but bear with me, I'll do it relatively quickly. So when we talk about trauma-informed, I think, I don't know, when we started off this work, we never assessed for trauma, but we have those incredible emergence of epidemiological studies like the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Event Study, which again, you can plug in and look at. And you know what that study told us, and what we started to realize in our own longitudinal data with impacted women, is that the most common experience that women report or share with us is that they have a history of trauma. And women at greatest risk, the A study really showed us that women at greatest risk for behavioral health, medical and mental health problems are also more likely to have experienced prolonged, repeated exposure to childhood sexual abuse and other adverse events. And they're more likely to experience victimization in adulthood. So if those things have occurred in childhood, there's a greater risk in adulthood where we see, unhealthy and unsupported relationships occurring. And we also hear we see a higher incidence of mental health issues, including depression, PTSD, anxiety, and then the use of alcohol and other drugs. When we talk about gender responsive, we are talking about trauma. We have to talk about trauma. And that doesn't mean we want all of our staff to become counselors in treatment. I wish more would take that on. But it does mean this. It means minimally, staff have to be aware of the prevalence of trauma and the impact, and why perhaps women are maybe exhibiting a challenging behavior. They have to learn to recognize when she's experiencing a traumatic reaction or she's engaging a survival behavior, and then they have to learn to respond in ways to prevent or mitigate that. This is minimally. If we're not going to do harm, we have to embed trauma-informed practices into our work with women. The other core practice that we encourage, I have to say, I'm always grateful. If I'm training an audience, I'm so grateful when folks have been exposed to any strengths-based intervention like motivational interviewing. Because what we learned very, very quickly in our work with women is that we are more likely to provide that much needed space and to engage women when we use a strengths-based approach. And I'm going to tell you, it's not easy. The narratives expressed by many impacted women are rife with statements of hopelessness, despair, and self-loathing. And many of you have worked with women, when we hear these themes constantly. However, I have to say, if you start with the belief that everyone has strengths, they may not agree with you in a moment, but if you work intentionally to help her identify them, to mobilize them, to build on her strengths, and you affirm them, then we're helping women rewrite their narrative, their story. And so I like to ask questions always, like, what are you currently doing to feel safe? What are you doing? What has worked for you in the past? What helps to address challenges? What helps you to cope? What have you done in the past when you've experienced depression? What support is available to you? So any kind of strength-based language is going to be important. Now, the next piece, this is another critical element or practice that is related to trauma or to gender responsive principles, is the central role of relationships. I mean, I don't think there is not a theory of female development that does not consistently emphasize the importance of relationships in women's lives, both in shaping their identities and shaping and contributing to their sense of worth. So there isn't any theory out there that doesn't talk about the importance of this. And incidentally, all of the recent research coming, the brain science research, the neurological research is saying the pathway to healing for women or for individuals who've experienced trauma is through relationships. But this is a dilemma, isn't it? Because, for a lot of folks in corrections, just that word raises some rancor. People get nervous about it. So what we're suggesting is we have to look at this. We know that relationships, it's their central role in pathways to the justice system, their central role to growth and resilience. We have to teach staff to be comfortable in developing professional relationships and therapeutic relationships with women that they serve. This has to happen. They have to be comfortable in not only being supportive of women, but also setting boundaries. And we want to teach them to use relational language. And what I mean by that, this is a term coined by Alyssa Benedict, and I love this because shifting people away from always using rule-based language, like if you don't get a job, you can't get your kids back, versus how about a more relational approach? I understand that you're concerned about reconnecting with your kids. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Every time we model concern and respect and good communication, effective communication, we're giving her an opportunity to do the same. So we want to make sure that we do that. Relational is an important practice. And then final piece here that is embedded in being gender responsive or using a gender responsive approach. Gender responsivity is working toward equity and inclusion. And one of the hard lessons that I have learned over the years is that, initially when we started to present and explore on the research in women, we were really challenged by impacted women to explore other identities, particularly race and sexuality, but poverty, looking at all of these identities that combine and intersect and contribute to issues for women. So we now have some guiding practices that we have developed. And so every time now, when we develop an evidence-based program or we're conducting research, we try to work intensely to recognize the intersection of those diverse identities. So we're trying to unpack them and look at them. And second, and probably even more importantly, we bring people to the table, so diverse stakeholders. And we're really trying to do more participatory research models where women are part of the research, impacted women, where they are with us when we're prioritizing initiatives, when they're with us when we're conducting research. So we're really working hard to bring these principles to the fore as we're doing this work. Okay, so how do we integrate this in what we do? I've talked about principles, those principles essential to being gender responsive. And I wanted to now just go back to what I promised earlier that we were going to do before I got myself all in a state. But I just want to talk a little bit about the gains in the research. And I'm going to do, as I mentioned, a high-level summary of what we know is working, where the evidence is. And then I'm going to ask you to do something. I'm going to ask you to invite you to consider your agency or practice and reflect a little bit on where you're at right now. So if you could pull out the handout on this, that would be great. Just pull out the handout. If not, don't worry, I'll guide you through it. I'll put up a slide with the actual questions in it if you don't have it handy. But I want you to reflect on this. One of the things that we assess in the GRIPA, and we have such a great deal of information on now, is agency culture. So obviously we need to have, it starts and it really is helpful when we have governance and management and leadership that is supportive of what we do. But we define a healthy culture when all stakeholders feel safe, supported, valued, and appreciated. And there are ways of determining how that should happen. And we often encourage agencies to do a survey and ask people and ask women and ask staff what they need to feel more appreciated and valued. But these surveys are powerful because they give you a really clear message of what's going on in the culture. And let's face it, if staff and women don't feel safe, there's nothing's going to happen, nothing's going to change because they're in survival mode and they're not going to be able to learn something new. So I have a tip for you. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but I do have a tip. One of the things that we're having incredible results with, and what we're seeing in agencies that are bringing in, and we're hearing from them, if they're bringing in training on trauma-informed care, then what they're finding is they can reshape their agency culture. So I won't talk a lot about these principles, but what they do is they start to do surveys and they determine if staff are feeling physically and emotionally safe, if clients are feeling, and physically and emotionally safe. And they talk to them and they determine that, and they really work hard and intentionally to make the environment safer. And that can mean anything, and that can mean a variety of things. But oftentimes it really means that the women feel listened to. It can be as simple and complex and complicated as that. The next principle is everyone has to feel that they can trust the people around them. So to maximize trust, the safest thing we can do particularly for women who have been traumatized, is ensure that they know what to expect, clear expectations, and always having structure and consistent boundaries. Giving women choices. Every time we give someone a choice, someone who's been denied choice, someone who has been traumatized in childhood, lost control often of their bodies or possessions or their lives, and they're hopeless in that moment. Every time you give somebody a choice, you give back some of that control. So it's really important we do that in giving staff choices and letting staff prioritize what their needs are. The other piece of this is collaboration. You'll hear that word over again, where everybody shares the power. Staff and clients are always working together. And then empowerment, where we work intentionally to build resilience. And we actually help people. All of those programs we developed are just one element of this. We give them personal resources. We also want to tune them into social resources. We've left you with a whole array of different elements that you can use. There's all kinds of trainings now for staff. I think this has been one of the most promising opportunities for training and shifting culture that I've seen. So I wanted to make sure we pass that on to you. Okay, so here's a reflective activity on culture for you. I want you to consider now, so if you have your paper handy, that's great. If not, just put a little number, just make a couple of notes now on this reflective activity. How much support do you have from your agency leadership to implement gender responsive policies and practices? And you might use a 3-scale rating: 0, nothing's in place, we're not really supported, partially, or 2, where we're really on a roll with this. So rate that. Now rate women, their family, staff. If you did a survey tomorrow, how confident are you that they feel safe, psychologically and physically? They feel listened to, respected. Consider the physical environment. And I want you to just reflect on how safe, clean, functional, and motivating is that environment. And again, use a 0, 1, 2 rating. And by, all of this, you can just take a moment with that. And then I'm going to move forward, because I lost so much time by not being hooked up to you so you could hear me. Okay, so that's just one domain, culture, a really important domain or important area as we're starting to adopt and build on a gender responsive approach for women. Let's go to another domain that has all kinds of research attached to it. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this, because what we're seeing, agencies who are really making an intentional effort with staffing and training are getting better outcomes. I don't think that surprises you, but it starts with who we hire. And I think there's an interesting thing, because, women were such a small part of the population. Often staff are rotated in positions to work with women without any training, and still are. And often they didn't know what to expect, or they had heard that working with women was not the most popular thing to do. So what's interesting is that we're encouraging agencies now, start by really looking at who you hire, who's interested in working with women. Do behavioral exercises to see if the staff you're hiring are comfortable to talk with women, relating to women, and if they can actually set up a boundary when they're working with women. The content of training is essential. So some of the things on the right-hand side that we have listed there, of course, you have to know the research, the pathways research, what factors bring women into the system. I already mentioned trauma-informed care. And I do want to mention a model that was developed by Alyssa Benedict, Erica King, and I got to work on that with them, called Creating Regulation and Resilience. And it's a communication model, and it teaches staff in the moment how to first help women who are struggling or experiencing a challenging moment, or exhibiting a challenging behavior, to regulate themselves, and then go on to phase 2, where they can actually work collaboratively with them to do something differently. So there's all kinds of training and experiences available now. I think the biggest piece is teaching staff boundaries and teaching them to align all of this stuff. It has to align with their roles and responsibilities. So it has to be meaningful for them. Now, training is really important, but it puts us on the same page, because it all puts us on the same page. But I wish I could all ask you this question again. 2005, Dean Fixon and his colleagues published a seminal paper on implementation science. And he wrote this paper, a meta-analysis, the synthesis on implementation science. It changed my life. I think it changed many of our lives, those of you who are on this call. It certainly changed the landscape of training, because what we were doing, I was out there training in the early days, and I had a colleague who used this expression, okay, spray and pray, we're going to do this training, we'll just hope it sticks to people. And that's really what it felt like. We never knew what was happening after. What Dixon's group showed us is that if you are trying to make any kind of adaptive change in your organization, anything that requires staff to change attitudes or learn new skills, then you have to realize it's going to be hard, it's going to take time, it occurs in stages, and it's going to be a long while before you get to full implementation. That's one important lesson. But I think even another one that was really important for me is that, yes, training is the starting point, or it might be a starting point, but if you don't have coaching, quality assurance, ongoing supervision, then most staff fail to build the confidence and competence they need to fully implement new skills. I can tell you so many, I wish we could have the whole hour on that. There's so many stories about that. But if you want to sustain a new initiative, you also have to build momentum and have staff honor the attitudes and skills and continue to build competencies, then you have to be, that has to be reflected in performance evaluation. So all of this is very important. Okay, one little aside before I get you to do some ratings on this, just to give you a sense of, there are folks that are implementing Fixton's model, and there is one model one sort of example of this, of good implementation, where they decided they were going to start with trauma-informed care. And this agency created a team, identified experts to review their policies and practices and deliver training in trauma-informed practices. They created protocols for training and coaching and QA, and they brought all these opportunities in the moment to support staff as they implemented all of this new stuff. And this went on this didn't happen overnight. This was over a few years. And then they did an evaluation and they reported back to staff. And the metrics they used were interesting. So this was a facility setting, and what they saw were decreases by incarcerated people on staff. So women, fewer staff assaults, fewer assaults, and women assaults between women, fewer segregation placements, fewer disciplinary reports, fewer suicide attempts. This model was conducted by or supervisor, or I should say, I just want to give honor, Lise Bissonnette in Framingham, Massachusetts, who did this initial work. And we've adopted this model in a number of our different settings, and really excited. Elizabeth Dick right now is doing some work in community settings, and she's seeing, using this model, decreases in probation and parole violations and increased program compliance. Use the trauma-informed principles to help start as you're led beginning to gender-informed practices. And incidentally, just want to say, this applies to men too. Every time we've done this work on trauma, we have state agencies approaching us to build this into their work with men. And it's powerful. Okay, so here's your reflective activity. So rate yourself here. Again, you can use whatever rating you want. You're not doing it yet. 1, you're starting. 2, you're well underway. Staff recruitment and hiring, you're bringing in staff that are committed to working with women. You have required training that prepares staff and agencies to use gender responsive, trauma-informed, strength-based relational approaches and practices. And you have managers and supervisors that are coaching and holding staff accountable for doing this work. So take a moment to reflect on that. Okay. I'll give you 1 second. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to assessment. Oh, we have so much work in this area, so much research in this area. And we start to talk about standardized assessment and case planning. I just have to begin this segment by telling you that gender-neutral tools predict for males and females. So you may be wondering why we're going to talk about gender responsive, encouraging you to use a gender responsive assessment. Well, here's what happens. So the gender responsive tool, or gender neutral tools, so standardized early assessments are working. But practitioners in the field noticed something funny. They just didn't think they were really working for women. And so a couple of researchers, Pat Van Verst and Patricia Hardiman, went out and they conducted a series of studies on these tools, and they realized there was something going on. In fact, they discovered that those standardized assessments, those earlier tools, were routinely overclassifying women. When they disaggregated by gender, they discovered that high-risk women were really moderate and often low risk. And that's a real problem. Obviously, any of you working in the field know that those designations can inform where people are placed if you're in a facility, but also supervision levels and dosage. So it's interesting that, that discovery was really powerful for the field. And I have to say, the developers of risk assessments responded very quickly to that. And you'll now see that there are modified cutoff scores for gender. So if you don't think gender matters, then why have we changed those cutoff scores? It absolutely does. Okay. As a clinician, one of my greatest dilemmas in using these tools is the missed opportunities. We just weren't identifying the issues that women were presenting to us. And it was a real concern when you're doing case management. So I want to present this to you. This is more fully detailed in pages 11 to 15. So please have a look at those in the resource guide. But Pat Van Voorhis started this work. Her colleagues, Emily Salisbury and others, have contributed to this work. And now so many others have replicated it. If we're going to do an assessment, please ask about relationships. Unpack the reason she has committed that offense. Understand the circumstances and context of why she's there, and you'll often discover domestic violence, sex work, she's protecting others, a relational, as we said earlier, relationships often a pathway to crime. We have to unpack that and understand it and treat that or address that. Talked about trauma already. We've talked about mental health issues, but it's important to know the symptoms, what she's expressing, what her needs are. Pat Van Voorhees' work really unpacked how important child custody is. You know, if women are worried about child custody when they're inside, then they tend to have greater difficulties. But also, you know, Pat discovered that on the outside, it's the first thing women want to address, or often the first thing women want to address. They want to deal with, you know, establishing their custody when they return. They also, the other thing she discovered is that parenting skills play a significant role for those of you working in the community. So women who are not confident in their parenting skills really struggle with how to parent children. And if they have high levels of stress, there is a remarkable, significant return to substance abuse. Okay, I'm going to come back to the other ones in a moment. I'm going to flip back and forth to the next slide for a second. Those factors have to be addressed. The other thing that was happening at the same time as these gender responsive assessments were being developed, the youth, sort of the work with youth researchers working with youth started to unpack this whole notion of the importance of protective factors and strengths. I love this work. It's really interesting because what they discovered is that if you pull out and really start to assess strengths, one, people don't start to look at as someone who is high risk as just a bundle of problems, but they see their strengths. The other thing is that what they found and discovered is that if people have, what the strengths that people have, or some of these strengths are actually so protective, they can insulate someone from negative outcomes. And we know from the resiliency research, the more strengths or protective factors you have, the greater the ability to bounce back. We want to build on strengths is what I'm trying to say. I think it really changes the paradigm of when we're working with women and men. And so let's go back to those three bottom bullets of Pat Van Voorhees' initial work. You know what she found? Strength, like self-efficacy. So if I have confidence that I can parent effectively, it's a protective factor. It actually buffers risk. If I have confidence that I can get a job, so having certificates, having my GED, knowing that I can earn a living wage and have a fulfilling job, it is a buffering, huge impact, a protective factor. Okay, this one I can't emphasize enough. Safe, affordable housing. Almost every woman I have worked with who's leaving prison is concerned about that. They need to know that they're going to a safe place, that they're going to be welcomed, they're going to be treated respectfully. So, and finances around that. So women, having some financial stability, especially if they're dealing with children, if they have children that they're caring for. So the focus on strength is hugely important. I encourage you, if you're doing an assessment and it's not looking at strength, pull some of them out, have your staff start looking at, hey, what does she have that can buffer? Who's there to support her? Are there some resources there to help her? Because strengths predict over and above risk factors. They add something new to this equation, and they're really powerful. Okay, so gender responsive assessment, we know we do better at prediction. We incorporate the research on women. We're better at it. We have that data now that's available, and we are better prepared, I think, to do case planning. And I won't spend a great deal of time with this. This is also in your guide, but I do want to mention there was this wonderful amount of research and support, technical assistance that emerged in 2006 from the federal dollars were just funneling into reentry research. And it was powerful in the day. There are all kinds of reentry models that were emerging. We saw a lot of them in corrections. Some of you may have implemented them already, like STIX or EPIC or STARS. So these models are in place out there. We're fortunate enough that NIC actually approached us, and we worked with them on a cooperative agreement to develop a casework model that was strictly for women. And it's called the collaborative casework model. It was formerly the women offender case management model. We changed that as quickly as we could. But we found this model really had an impact not only on recidivism outcomes, but other intermediate targets. And there's a paper that you can access to look at that. I just want to share with you, if you know, I mentioned earlier how important case management can be. Another tip to you, if you want to advance work with women, invest in this. And what that means is invest in ensuring that your case management practices are effective. Because what we did with this model, for example, is we brought in all the core elements that we see from correctional practices and all the core elements that we're working in these big wraparound programs. And what all of them say are the same thing. So the elements you need to have a really impactful case management model are you have to do an individual assessment. And we're going to encourage you, as I mentioned already, to use a gender responsive risk assessment. Want you to use that assessment at intake and at regular intervals until discharge. Want you to prioritize needs with women. So if you do an assessment, why not summarize some of the results, some of the major results and risk factors, the needs she has, the challenges she's facing, and then work with her collaboratively to prioritize those. Then you've got to start matching her to programs and services that are relevant, that she has a choice in. Review regularly with her for goals and update case plans and monitor progress. That, I think, is a really essential element. And then I can't emphasize how important agency partnerships are. Like, not only bring them on your teams, you can formalize partnerships, work together collaboratively. That's wonderful. Women, again, center of that team. But it helps to ensure continuity of care. And if there's anything we discovered as we were implementing these models, is that continuity of care, anytime we take a moment to provide women with information about a community service or introduce her to a partner or let her know where she's going, again, it's that safety piece. Here is the person, here is the information, here is the person you're going to be connected with. We had, it was incredible how more likely women were to access that service. Okay. Reflective question time. I want you to do this, again, using that same grid. Are you using an assessment tool that's been validated for use with women? Okay, and even if it's a standardized assessment, ensuring that it was validated for women. Is your process gender responsive? I didn't talk a lot about that, but are we talking to women to uncover their risk, strengths, and needs? Are we doing that in a relational way, in a respectful, I'm interested in your story way? Is the case planning process individualized, collaborative, growth fostering? Is the case planning process supporting that continuum of care? Are you working to build agency partnerships? A lot of stuff. It's a lot. So just rate that. Okay, one more domain, and then I'm going to leave them alone, I promise. Okay. I think I have perfect time here. So last domain is treatments and services. We have so much information on this now. Lots of research on programs that were written specifically for women. And, I just have a little caveat on this. I think just like assessment, EBP programs have the biggest pushback on developing programs for women from the field. It was interesting to me. The argument was like, why are you bringing in these programs for women? We've got programs that are gender neutral. We don't need these specialized programs. Women are benefiting with these other ones. You don't even have any evidence to support their use. Well, I just want to say to all of you, we do now. So 2016 first meta-analysis, we've got a meta-analysis that is looked across an array of articles, 22,000 women in total in these different studies, reflected throughout these studies. And incidentally, this meta-analysis conducted by Gobet, Blanchette, and Stewart, they also put in an equal number of studies for women in different settings, so women in custody and women in community. And what they found is when programs are implemented well, and I'm going to put that caveat there because it's not in the slide. So just so we emphasize this, when they're done with rigor, with good implementation science, then they address the salient needs of women. They demonstrate more favorable outcomes than gender neutral programs. So we've got proof now that some of these programs are working. And if you look in your resource guide, there are 7 pages, pages 21 to 28, with all kinds of information on programs that show promise, that have research evidence, and that we're continuing to gather information on. There are programs obviously the Covington programs, one of the first programs to come out for women beyond trauma, dialectical behavior therapy with Linehan. We've got, Seeking Safety from Lisa Najovitz, and moving on that I had the opportunity to work with people on. So there's so many programs now that are out there. I mentioned earlier, there's all kinds of programs. We have one mentioned here on, again, by Covington, but there are so many good evidence-based substance abuse programs now available. There are programs for women who have come into the system with a violent offense. There are parenting programs to build that efficacy and confidence. There are employment programs that are getting good results. We have programs for children with incarcerated parents. We have programs that are addressing the major needs that women are facing, and they're available to us. So one final comment before I have you rate your agency right now, or rate your practice right now. I want to just make a quick comment on gender responsive services. I hope you'll make a note to yourself, because I have erred in not putting housing on here, and it should be in big, bold, letters. We're really not providing services to help women stabilize. And, it's interesting. I've done so much work over the years. When I first started this work, we thought that gender responsive, we didn't have to have research for everything. Some of it just made common sense. But I have to tell you, even the common sense things, we've been battling for years to get done. I just have to share one big battle. We have battles in some settings still to provide women with hygiene products. We have battles in many settings. My niece is an OBGYN in Atlanta, and she, the other day, had to insist that the officer step out of the room while she was delivering a baby. They wanted to shackle her, and that's still happening, not as often, thankfully. We're still not changing dietary requirements for women. We're still using the same caloric intake that counts that they use for men in many settings. We're not making, there's still areas where physical changes have been made to settings to accommodate child visiting rooms and all kinds of things. So those very basic practical things are still occurring. Gender matters. And you think you wouldn't need to promote that? That would be common sense. But, we started with a system for men, and that's the legacy we have. So the other two things I want to mention, or a couple of things I want to mention. We've done a lot of GIPAs and GRIPAs, these agency-wide assessments over the years, and there are two areas that come out as problematic almost universally, or where women and staff have the most complaints. And usually it's related to medical and mental health services because they're not accessible, or sometimes it's quality, they're not timely. Staff are not trained to work well with women. But I just want to toss out one thing too that's really, really important in all of this. We're missing opportunities because women are presenting with significant health challenges. They're coming to us, they're extremely high, and it could be due to earlier life histories that involve being victims of serious violence or drug use or lack of pre and postnatal care, poor nutrition. But women need to learn about medical issues. And if we don't have people there that can train that, we've got to start bringing in people from the community to help, subsidize our work. We just have to provide opportunities for women to learn more about their bodies and their health. Okay, having said all that, this section a really big one. Just want to reflect for a moment on this. Programs and services available for women to address identified needs. You know what? I haven't seen any agency that can address all of them. But are you identifying? Are these services available for mental health, for trauma, for domestic violence, for to help women build strength? Do you have programs and services that are gender responsive and evidence-based? So making sure they're gender responsive. And I don't mean those programs that, that were designed for men and just adapted content. I mean, really designed for women that address those targets and their experiences. Also, some of the emerging research that's happening right now, peer-led co-facilitation, when it is done well, just a shout out to some of the agencies that are doing this work, like Michigan. Fantastic results when they're bringing in and training women, impacted women, to deliver these services. And then reflect on if you have access to information about programs, if women and staff have access to information about programs and services. Is that available to everybody? Is eligibility clear? Is outcomes clear? Are programs being delivered with fidelity? And I know these are really big questions, but just do a little general rating and it might help you do the one final activity that I have for you. Okay, so big wrap up. We have 30 years of experience, research with women, and not experience, research. We're starting to see some really positive outcomes. We know that when we expand the risk, need, responsibility framework and we include items, target need areas, and provide services that are relevant to women, we're getting better results, and we're seeing that across the board. When we deliver programs in a trauma-informed, strength-based, relational, and culturally informed way, we get better results. And I'm going to encourage you, enlarge your metrics. Don't just focus on recidivism. There's a real call out there now by researchers. Don't always focus on recidivism. We have to look at what's happening, why women are returning. So look at what's happening when they're in the community. Are they, are we seeing an increase in their ability to communicate with their family members, or their relationships are healthier? Are they employed? So looking at those intermediate targets. And then address limitations that are imposed by not including, include diverse people to inform your policies and practices, and the limitations of your current practices. And I already mentioned the gender response approach. I like saying that over and over again. So we get good results when we do this. So one of the things we hope that we've done today is just demonstrate that first of all, we need to improve outcomes for women. We're impacting children and families. We're impacting their children. They're being impacted by the carceral process, no matter where they are in the system. And, when we start to use the research on women, the fog lifts and we have better outcomes. So just those are two strong messages we have for you today. And I have one last assignment before I'm going to turn this over to you. So one last thing I'd like you to do. Would you please, before we move on to Q&A, can you review your responses if you've had a record of them, or if something really resonated with you? Think of your strengths and challenges as we've walked through these. Here are the key areas, here are the tips. And I want you to look over the last 12 months, or picture the next 12 months, and I want you to think of one opportunity going forward. And would you put it in the chat box? We're not going to bring them all up. We just want to see if there are areas, consistent areas that people are identifying. So put in the chat box one opportunity that would advance your work if you address that over the next 12 months in your work with women. Oh, I convoluted that. Anyway, okay, so while you're doing that, we assume that you can multitask. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who is going to lead you in the Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Van Dieten. You really brought this material to life. And now we're excited to have a couple moments here now for questions and answers. So if you haven't had a chance yet, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of the screen. We did already get a couple of questions in, so I'd like to start with this one. Just going back to an earlier part of your presentation, someone's asking, what does it mean that community corrections is a driver to women's incarceration?
Yeah, so I'm going to encourage you to have a look at the article by Q, because it's so clearly defined there. But what they're saying is that it's not new crimes. They're essentially saying it's not necessarily new crimes that are, the determinant of people coming back to jail or prison. It's technical violations. So if we're in the community, if we are using technical violations, and I know that's what we have done historically, if people are non-compliant with a court order, they're not responding, they're absconding, all of those reasons, then we use technical violations and we return them to jail. And so that's what they mean by a driver of incarceration. So people coming back are coming back for that reason.
Great. And then we got a question that's sort of in two parts. So I'll ask the first part first. Could you expand on women's complex reentry or supervision needs? What's meant by that?
So what we're seeing in the data over and over again is that, So there are basic survival needs that women have that are not necessarily being addressed. And the tough part about a presentation like this is that there's so many agencies doing a brilliant job with it. So I just want to honor those folks that are, and incidentally, that's why we can talk about what's working, because there's so many people doing it. But we're seeing still routinely reports where women are coming out without the baby. They don't know about housing. They don't know where they're going to be returning to. They don't know how they can even reestablish child custody and access. They don't know, they don't have identification. So those are the basic stability factors that are happening out there, but there are other really complex needs. So one of the things that we're seeing routinely is that women are coming out with profound mental health issues. And unless they are connected with medical supports and mental health supports, they continue to struggle with those issues. They're not going to go away when they leave prison. And I think there was something people thought that was magical was going to happen just by going back to the community. We have to ensure that this sort of continuum in care. So if we identify folks with really high needs in those areas, stability factors and complex trauma and mental health needs, then we've got to ensure that we provide them with wraparound services as they're leaving to the community. And there is a beautiful program in Michigan. I have the great pleasure of seeing what they're doing there. So women who were within prison in Michigan, women who are in prison there and who were identified with these complex needs, were offered support. So they brought people, providers to reach in and deal with the anxiety people might have about returning to the community. And not only that, wraparound services for those women. Now, of course, they didn't have the resources to do this with everyone, so they provided it to the women with the most complex needs. And that's when it starts. A long-winded discussion on that. But if you, I can provide you with resources with someone that you can talk to at Michigan if you want to look at a model program. It's really interesting.
Thank you. And following that, someone asked, what are or why are there more technical violations or disciplinary reports for women?
Yeah, this was a phenomena. We don't see this everywhere, but we're finding this across the board in some of the early sites we were working with. And what women tell us, what many impacted women believe is that when they start to use their voice or ask for information, and I'm talking about inside, this is often interpreted by many, by practitioners as non-compliance, and then they get disciplinary reports. There have been many state agencies that are unpacking the definitions of disciplinary incidents. Women are less likely to have severe disciplinary incidents, but those minor and moderate ones they start to pile up, and it impacts their quality of care inside, or can impact their access to resources inside. In probation and parole, what we're seeing is that for many women who are not connecting, women would tell us in the early days, their priorities were their children. And I'll tell you, almost every probation department we worked with in 2000, not every practitioner, but there were allowances for children. So if women failed to attend a session, and that continued because they were dealing with other priorities and needs, they would receive a technical violation for that. So it was almost a lack of awareness of what the challenges were or the barriers that women were facing. And incidentally, more than men, women are facing all kinds. It's not just probation and parole conditions and mandates they've got all kinds of welfare conditions or child welfare issues. They have all of these competing demands, typically far more than men if they have children, to access those as well. So sometimes we would have a woman, I remember working a community program where a woman had to appear for her probation appointment. Then she had an appointment with a welfare officer. She had an appointment with a child welfare worker. Like, this is all in the same day. I'm not sure how any of us on this call can navigate that. So again, competing priorities. We're not seeing it as much anymore. So I gave you my historical presentation. That's what happens when you have somebody who's been in the system way too long. I think I'm stuck in the 80s and 90s. But what's really interesting is that we still hear it. And it's something that we have to address.
Another question came in around how many women or what is the percentage of women in the justice system due to domestic violence. I wasn't sure if this person meant as sort of victims of domestic violence or more as perpetrators, but is this an issue of domestic violence that you see often?
Okay, so I'm so glad you asked the question because it's one of my favorite topics. We've done a lot of research in this, and of course the statistics vary, but I'm just going to share some results from a study that we did where we started to sort of untangle women that were strictly there for domestic violence and women who were in the system for other violent charges. And the high preponderance is domestic violence by far. There's just no question of it. And I can tell you without issue, like, I mean, almost 90% of women, or it's probably even higher, coming into the system for domestic violence or violent behaviors of any kind have a history of domestic violence themselves, have been victims. So they're not only victims, they're not coming in as perpetrators, they're coming in as victims. And that's one of the biggest reasons I encourage people not to use or to use programs that have women in mind, domestic violence programs that honor that understand the trauma that has occurred before and that has shaped women's relationships and how they develop relationships, so that if you're doing a domestic violence program and you put women into a co-ed group or a program that was designed, and I hate that language, but male battery program, if you put women into that kind of program, what you're doing essentially is discounting her history, her experiences, her reality. So the percentages are very high that they have both, that they are both. I haven't ever seen any data suggesting differently. Did I answer? I'm not sure I answered the question, or if I went.
Yes, you did. And the person actually confirmed that they were speaking more to the victim side for domestic violence as well.
Yeah. So we are putting women, incarcerating women, or having women in services and in these very long, intensive programs. And it's interesting, beautiful study that was done out of Minnesota, and they looked at the women first charged for domestic violence, and their reoffense rate, the baseline for reoffending, is almost non-existent. So providing them with information and support is the answer, not a 52-week program for batterers, right? Anyway, that's my view. I'll just leave that there before I.
We also got a question around if the studies looked at throughout the presentation included trans women, and just more generally curious to hear how these programs are also being gender responsive to the unique needs of women who are trans.
Oh, I'm so grateful for that question. So I had the opportunity to work with a colleague, Shelley Brown, out of Canada. She and her group did an intensive review of the research. We are not including LGBTQ populations. We're not including trans women in our research. We could find yourself. Like there is some, not suggesting it's not there. We have not done that. Again, we have not done it by race. We have not done it by sexual identity or orientation or expression. We haven't. So it's something that we are looking at. And the excuse has always been, the excuse when we didn't include women is that the sample size is small. And that's still an excuse that's used all of the time. It's just not good enough anymore. I mean, when I use that language of bringing diverse stakeholders to the table, that's what's helping us design programs. So what we're hoping is if we bring individuals to the table with us and say, hey, help us, what do you need? What are your needs? And they're there to support and develop and prioritize our needs, we're going to get the outcomes we need. So, yeah, we haven't. I wish I could say there's a lot. There is some data on, some data in the domestic violence research, but I have to say it's just not there yet. I didn't find it terribly helpful when I was looking in that area.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. These are all just such great questions. Someone else asked, what makes DBT, dialectical behavioral health therapy, effective as a treatment model for women who are survivors of incarceration?
Yeah, that question, I've had that question asked before. I think for me, and when I've seen it, where a big part, and I didn't mention this is all the stuff that could be done or should have been done in this presentation. It is a lot of how it's facilitated. So again, we always look that these programs are delivered in a gender responsive way. So they're trauma-informed relational. Why I like DBT is that it was designed by Marsha Linehan, who's had experience with these issues herself. She has she has an understanding of what it took for her. And she literally designed these skills as like retraining the brain. And we know from the neurosciences, we have to retrain our brain and build new competencies, new skills and strategies. Part of its facilitation has to be done well, and it has to be done with it. But it also, we're seeing that women are really responsive to DBT, like at least in the programs that we've observed and the data we've collected, the outcomes are quite good. It's calming, it's regulating, it's helping them build relationships. So all of the things, that the essential pieces that are missing, it sort of targets the salient needs. Does it address the social determinants and stability factors women need to have addressed, like housing, et cetera? No. So it's not a panacea, but I think it's a wonderful program, I think, when it's done well.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. This is a question from someone who works in a community-based reentry program for women. And they were saying that they have encountered a lot of resistance from many of the women to access mental health services. And could you comment on how to help them see the value and encourage them to access the services?
Yeah. Oh, such a great question. When we started the case management model, we encountered many of the same sort of a resistance and a distrust. So one of the first things we did, and again, we had the resources to do this, so it was really ideal. We invited providers and we created formal MOUs with them, and we cross-trained. So what that means is everybody was trained in, relational, strength-based, trauma-informed approaches at the same time. We practiced within our roles and responsibilities. So that was one way we did it. The other thing is, having anyone from a mental health agency come to your agency if you can, inviting them for brown bag lunches even, and having them meet with the women and talk about their services is a really big help. We found that to be invaluable. There's a group in Iowa that started doing that work, and I couldn't believe the change. They meet together as providers, because incidentally, we're all working with the same people. So it's really important that we're all on the same page. And I think a lot of the mental health providers, we assume because they have training in this, that they know how to respond in a gender responsive, trauma-informed way, and that's not necessarily true. So you may have to actually provide that training for them, but certainly inviting them to your house, so to speak, and not literally, but inviting them in and doing a brown bag lunch and telling them about the women you serve and what would make it feel safer for women to meet with them can be really helpful.
And sorry, one quick other question, Marilyn. Just going back to the earlier question when someone asked about women's complex reentry or supervision needs, you mentioned a Michigan contact. Would you mind just repeating who that was?
Oh, actually, would you email me and I'll introduce you? So my contact information is, or you can email me directly. That would be great if you don't mind, and then I'll introduce you to her. I'm going to inundate her with people, but yes, I would be happy to do that.
Great, and there is contact information on the last PowerPoint slide that you guys will all be receiving as well. Thank you so much.
I'm going to just show that real quick.
Oh, you can go back as I'm talking. Well, thank you everyone so much for your really insightful questions, and special thank you to Dr. Van Dieten for your wonderful presentation and materials today. So yes, the remaining slides contain information regarding the additional resources. We're excited, contact information, and information for the CSG Justice Center newsletter sign up, which is towards the end. Again, as a reminder, we've recorded this webinar and we'll be posting it along with the PowerPoint slide deck on our CSG Justice Center website events page within the next 2 weeks. Again, thank you all for joining us. Take care.